We are actually just outside of Las Vegas at the very end of our Death Valley trip. So we've been out here for 7 or 8 days in some very remote areas in Death Valley, and now this is our final night of the trip. We're wanted to position ourselves close to the city, but not so close to the city that we couldn't find a cool camp spot.
Yeah. Can you give me a little synopsis of who all is on the trip? Maybe not everyone's names and their titles, but how many people and
Well, we started with
the length of the trip?
We started with 13 people, of the kind of 17 that are part of Mosko, either full-time people working in our headquarters or contractors that we work very closely with, but basically the kind of Mosko crew. And so we had 13 to start the trip. Now we're down to 9 because people have had to peel off. We had one breakdown, minor injury, another minor injury, and then a few folks that had to take off early to get home to their families. So now we're down to the final 9. And tomorrow we'll pull into the city and load the bikes up in the trailers, and folks will head off to the airport, and JC and Ames will drive the trucks home.
It's quite an undertaking getting everyone out here for a trip like this, huh?
Yeah, it's a big undertaking. And we started doing these company trips. Well, really, when we started, there were only a few of us in the company. And so we would have our bikes, our own personal bikes, were the bikes we used to trade shows. And so the idea was that since we were already towing our bikes around to go to the trade shows, why don't we just use them and go for a ride after one of the shows? And would do a trip in the spring and a trip in the fall, and there were just 3 or 4 of us. Now we have so many more people, and this is definitely the biggest one we've ever done. And I was really wondering how it was going to go, and actually it went fantastic because everybody kind of split up in little groups. It was just super cool. And unlike some of the past trips where I've been the primary navigator, here we had almost half the company navigating. And so folks who didn't want to navigate could just sort of pair up with whoever they felt like pairing up with, and it was just all very organic. And so it wasn't like we were one big 13-person ride. It was actually, in fact, you and I got to ride together for a good chunk of the trip, just the 2 of us. So it was very cool.
Yeah, it was very cool. I'll ask you a few more questions probably at the end about the trip, but
Okay.
I've been asking everyone the same exact question. I just thought it would be interesting to get everyone's take on what do you get from this when we come out here and do this multi-day, dual sport, unsupported team ride thing that we do?
Yeah.
What is it that you take away from it?
Man, that's such a huge question, because, I think what we call what we're doing riding, but actually it's a lot more than that. It's travel. We're visiting places. We're spending time together with the team when we do it as part of a group, or with each other when we're doing it just you and I, or even just when we're doing it solo, we're spending time with ourselves. So people, I think, is a big part of it. And then also the people we meet as we travel, and then the places we go through, whether it's like here, kind of off-road. Death Valley is a very interesting way to kind of experience Death Valley, or when we're overseas, like, traveling through places like Africa, South America, Asia, stuff like that. I think because the nature of motorcycle travel is just so totally unpredictable. Like, you don't really know where you're going to sleep. You don't know what challenges you're going to encounter. You don't really know the terrain if you're not familiar with the place. You don't necessarily know where you're going to restock on food and water and gasoline. And so there's this big element of unpredictability to it. In fact, when you get to the end and you look back at the trip, it was like partly you and your decision to go to this place and to bring the bike you brought and to take the routes you took, but it's also partly a function of the place, because the place is what set the terrain and the weather and things like that. And so really the trip, when you tie a bow around it at the end and you look back, you say, well, that was part me and part the place, that created this interesting thing. And each one is different from the one before it, and so like, that's what I think is really different from the experience of like traveling through a place another way. If you just kind of came through with your camper trailer or spent a night at a campground, had dinner at a restaurant and said, oh, I saw Death Valley, it's lacking that element of unpredictability that we experience. And I think that's really cool that the place shapes the trip. That's one of the things I really love about it. So anyway, I kind of got off track there. The question was, what do I personally get out of it? I mean, I think, on this trip, I got to see Death Valley and experience it in that very interesting and unpredictable way. I felt like I really got to spend quality time with the team, so the people was a big aspect of it for me this trip. Like, just can't believe how well we all travel together. I feel like it's so hard to find even a single person that you travel well with, let alone 13, This is the coolest thing. And so for this trip, definitely the people was a big part of it. And then, you know, I also get like, I always have this feeling of kind of rightness when I'm on a motorcycle trip or after a motorcycle trip. And I've thought a lot about what's at the root of that. Definitely for me, part of it is that when I'm riding, I have so much of my brain power is just like totally focused on riding. Like there's no room for my mind to wander or other thoughts. There's something like sort of zen about it, because the speed at which you're traveling and the amount of time you have to sort of read the terrain in front of the bike and then process that information and translate it into actions, with your right hand on the throttle and the brake and your left hand on the clutch and your right foot on the brake and your left foot on the shifter and your body weight and your balance. Like it happens so fast, like, and you're just on this scrolling sort of like interpretation of the terrain in front of you, and that information has to come in, get processed into action, and then be exited out the back of your head like so quickly that it becomes like sort of all encompassing. And so it's almost like a meditation, and it's really interesting. And even sometimes I can have just enough space left in my head to contemplate a very simple thought, and sort of turn it over, but I can't get too deep or too complicated or follow too many tangents or too many rabbit holes because the terrain brings me back, and so that's a really interesting thing. And then I feel like on a trip like this, the riding is one part of it, but then like the camping and the travel is another part of it. And when I go out, if you were to like look at our house and like count every single object in the house, like count every socket and tool and every fork and knife and spoon and every plate and cup and bed sheet and article of clothing and all of our toys and all of the different things we have at home. We have so much stuff, like way more stuff than humans were ever meant to possibly accumulate, And when we go out on a camping trip, we consolidate all of our stuff down to just like this little tiny thing. The only stuff we have with us is the stuff we can carry. We can't accumulate or take more things than we can carry. And that's a massive reduction. I mean, maybe if you counted all the things on my bike, it's 35 things or something like that, which is probably much more akin to the way our sort of ancestors traveled. And I think it, like, not to get too philosophical about it, but I think that our we were really designed to travel with very few things and travel with very few people, and to be sort of nomadic. I mean, that's the way our ancestry was. And so I feel like there's a part of this that sort of clicks with that, and it's something we get out of like even backpacking and kayaking and bike packing and all these things where you sort of go out and travel and you face a bunch of like obstacles and challenges and you have your stuff with you, and something about it just feels so right. That's why we keep doing it. We come back to it again and again. And so a trip like this, like, it combines that sort of sport meditative aspect and then that consolidation of our life into like this really finite thing where the only problems we have to think about are the problems that are right in front of us, problems of terrain, problems of navigation, problems of where we're going to sleep tonight or where we're going to refill our water or get more gas. Forget completely about problems that are 6 months away or a year away, and mortgages and insurance, business challenges and stuff, financing, and all. None of that shit matters. All you're thinking about is like, where are we going to sleep tonight, and I feel like maybe that registers with us, certainly registers with me in some kind of a deep way, and maybe that has something to do with genetics, or maybe it's just me, I don't know, but it feels right, That's a very long answer to your question.
I can relate. No, I can totally relate. I have a question. So how do you bring that with you back? Do you bring that with you back into your life? How do you like sort of encapsulate that and then feed it back into your life, or does it stop at the end of the trip and then you go back to thinking and doing, and or do you bring that, some of that meditative aspect, some of that like stillness with you back to your life?
I think it, for me, if a lot of the accumulation of stuff has to do with being stationary. And so if I'm stationary, I like having stuff, because it keeps me busy, it keeps me entertained, it keeps me challenged. But when I'm mobile, I don't need stuff. In fact, I don't even want stuff. I'm looking at my limited amount of stuff here and saying, this is too much, even these 35 things. I want less. But when I'm sitting at home, to stay entertained, because I feel like I'm just like programmed for motion. One of the ways I keep myself entertained is with lots of toys and distractions and things, But when I'm moving, when every day is different from the day before, then I don't need the stimulus that I get from stuff, the stimulation I get from stuff. I get the stimulation from all the things we talked about before,
Okay, and last question I have for you. This is by far the biggest, you've already said that in this interview, this is by far the biggest group that we've ever had on a team ride.
Yeah.
how fruitful and how fulfilling is it for you to be able to share this experience with so many people?
Oh, it's just the best, you know. It's seeing people on our team. You know, everybody came to the company with a different history with motorcycles and a different skill level. Everybody rode, you know, but at different levels and stuff like that. And seeing our team come together as riders, as friends, as travel buddies, you know, as work associates, all those things, like, is incredibly satisfying. And I think with like a lot of sports or a lot of activities or just a lot of things that we do, even trades and skills and stuff like that, there's a progression to it that, you know, in the beginning, just simply experiencing it is enough. And then there are different levels of experiencing it. You know, when you first start just getting on a bike, that first time you get on a bike and just let the throttle out, it's like, whoa, you know, and then you get out on the road or you get out on the trail and, you know, you keep discovering new levels of it, like the self-reliance and self-sufficiency that comes from knowing how to work on your bike or knowing how to fix the common problems you might encounter on a trip, and then tackling navigation, you know, how to find your way, and then the next evolution of that of finding an interesting way, you know, doing it the fun way. Okay, we can get from point A to point B, but how do we do it in an interesting, circuitous way? How do we make it challenging? What kind of challenging? How challenging? And then you keep escalating with those things, and at some point you get to the desire to share it with someone else, you know, and to show them about it. And that's an evolution of that curve, whatever the thing is, whether it's like carpentry or rock climbing or anything, you know, if you stick with it and you keep digging and keep getting to all those different layers, eventually you hit that layer of like, okay, wow, this is so amazing and it's meant so much to me that I want to share it with other people, you know. And so in a lot of ways, this is me doing that, you know. And so I take a tremendous amount of satisfaction from it, you know, the same way that I got that thrill the first time I ever twisted a throttle, you know. This is the evolution of that.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, oh, my pleasure.
Thanks for sharing this with all of us.
Yeah.